But we did go in 1993. It was an international expedition. There were Canadians and Americans on the team. No Canadian had ever climbed the mountain at that point. And K2 is a steep mountain. It's not, there aren't any particularly hard pitches on the Abruzzi Ridge, but it's, you know, the entire way, you're climbing the entire way. And a view of Balcony Serac above, the summit route up under the Balcony Serac goes like this. This is my partner Dan Culver, who died on this trip. Jim Haberl and Dan Culver and I ended up being the summit team on this expedition, or the first summit team. And the other really strong climber was Stacy Allison. And Stacy was a very good leader on this expedition. I can't compliment her leadership enough. And when it came time to divide up and prepare to go to the summit, I kind of thought, well, the logical summit team is Stacy and Dan and myself. Dan was strong. I'd been on the mountain before, and Stacy was climbing very well. And she didn't do it that way. She built the team, Dan and Jim and myself. And the reason she did that was to give the second team some strength. And Dan, while he was strong, had not been climbing all that long. He'd climbed Mount Everest. He'd done a lot of climbing. That long, I remember at one point, there were old, tattered fixed lines on the mountain. But Dan would attach his Jumar to the fixed line, and every time he took a step, he'd pull on it. And I said, Dan, don't do that. Because when you pull on it, you lean back on it, and if it gives, you're going to tumble over backwards and fall. And it was little things like that that caused me to worry and question the depths of Dan's preparedness for this mountain. We did make our summit bid. We had beautiful weather, and Jim, who had struggled with altitude sickness, climbed very well. He was very strong. He was right there with us. Strong, and we all arrived at high camp, and we woke at midnight. Not that we slept. We were climbing, of course, without oxygen or any other supplements. We woke at midnight and started melting water for our summit day. Dan and Jim left ahead of me at about 3 a.m. on their summit bid, and I stayed to melt another couple of liters, which takes a lot of time at these cold temperatures. And so I left about an hour behind them, caught them shortly here, and began breaking trail up. And I think probably the most dangerous part of the summit bid was traversing under this Balcony Serac, not because of the Balcony Serac itself. I'd never seen the Balcony Serac be active. You'll remember that in 2008, the Balcony Serac released during a summit bid on which an unheard of number of climbers were attempting the mountain, 22 people, and 11 died that day for various reasons. But I was worried not about the Balcony Serac, but the avalanche conditions on this slope. I reached the summit at about, well, 2:56 p.m., I remember. And I was, you know, quite close to Jim and Dan, but in time, very far away. Jim was about 100 yards behind me, you know, right in eye shot. But at this elevation, that's well over an hour in time. I called down to the base camp and I said, "This is Phil, I'm on the tippy top." And I remember people calling back up, you know, with celebratory comments. Barry Blanchard, a friend of mine from Canada, called up and said, "I can't believe there's a hick from Wyoming on top of K2." I descended. After about 25 minutes, I talked to Jim. I said, "Jim, you're about there. Keep going." But I'm concerned about Dan, and Dan was really moving slow. And we had made an agreement that one of us needed to be back in high camp by dark, because we knew that if you don't find high camp by dark, you might not find high camp. And I said to Jim, "That's what I'm doing, but I'm going to take Dan with me." I got to Dan. I had that conversation. Dan said, "No way. Summit's right there. This is K2. I've climbed Mount Everest. I'm going to climb K2. It's just right there. I'm not going down." And, you know, I don't know that he was wrong, or I didn't know that he was wrong, because the summit was right there. And so I gave him my radio, and I descended. And about 6 p.m., they summited. at about 4 in the afternoon. At about 6 p.m., I saw him right back here. We call that the bottleneck. It's the hardest part, the steepest part of the summit day on K2. And I was down here in high camp, and I thought, okay, we're good. Here he comes. They can see me. It's still dusk. They're through the difficulty, or almost through the difficulty. And then I poked my head back inside the tent to get back to my job of melting snow, and I heard Jim yell, "Help." And Dan had literally cartwheeled off the south face. I think he slipped. I remember when I came down through the balcony, I was facing out, going kind of fast, and I remember my crampons moving quickly through the kinetic snow, the sugary snow, and hitting the occasional rock. But I could imagine having that happen, throws your balance off, and you fall. And if you fall, you've got to stop yourself. It's steep enough to slide. And Dan slid. And I think he did not arrest his fall fast enough. And as a result, was then unable to stop himself and slid off the south face. 3 weeks later, a different team attempted the summit and found Dan's ice axe stuck in the snow right here. I went back to the Himalaya only one more time in 1995. I led a team of those same people I've spoken about so frequently tonight to try a yet unclimbed route on a mountain called Hidden Peak, which has great significance in American mountaineering as the only 8,000 meter peak first ascended by American climbers. Hidden Peak here, no one has ever climbed this particular ridge up to the summit of Hidden Peak, and that was our objective. And this was the last trip for me because sort of the final lesson from climbing, at least so far, started to come clear for me. And that is that you need to find out what really matters in your life. I went over with great ambition, and I'd really prepared myself to try some of the hardest routes in the world. And I was ready. But as I said earlier, I'm kind of a conservative guy. I mean, I think I needed 3 things. I needed to be ready, I needed the right people, and I needed the right conditions. And on these most extreme routes around the world, those right conditions just don't happen very often. And I realized that if I was going to be pursuing these hardest routes in the world and waiting for those magic rare conditions, I'd really be spending a lot of my time sitting in base camp and reading books. And that wasn't the way I wanted to spend my time. And so this was really my last big expedition. I've kept climbing, of course. I climb all the time. I climb still in the Wind Rivers, back where I began. I climb a lot in the Tetons. I climb a lot in the Front Range. I also climb with my family. And I spend time with my wife and climbing in the Flatirons with my kids. And I was blessed by being able to figure out that I didn't need to try harder and harder things to be happy. What I needed to do was to make good choices about every day. And once climbing became an endeavor where every day wasn't going to be satisfying because of the way my conservative nature cross-referenced with what had become interesting to me in the mountains, I've been able to move on to a different kind of climbing and a different phase of life, and I can't tell you what a blessing that's been. And that's why I'm here now at the American Alpine Club, because those lessons for me came out of climbing, and climbing remains an important part of my life, and I want to make sure it's available to every generation that follows. So I want to thank you for being here tonight, and I'd be happy to take a few questions.